This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show starts with two segments from Guy Allen, the senior economist at the IGP Institute, and Peter Goldsmith, director and principal investigator of the Soybean Innovation Lab at the University of Illinois, as they discuss how Africa could be the next big market for U.S. growers. Guy and Peter continue the show, explaining challenges and barriers to opening the market. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show, saying every dairy needs a biosecurity plan, whether it's for bird flu, New World Screwworm, or foot and mouth disease. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show talking about what's the next big market for U.S. growers with director and principal investigator of the Soybean Innovation Lab at the University of Illinois, Peter Goldsmith, and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. Peter, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Good to be here today to have the conversation. Thank you.
Peter, as we're talking about what's the next big market for U.S. growers, there's quite a bit of background history of how this research started.
Yeah. It started back in 2012 when representatives of the U.S. government came out to Illinois looking to understand soybean and the potential to develop the soybean market in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. They had seen high growth, high opportunity, export growth, and wanted to establish and invest directly in the soybean market development in Africa. Still, we have a well-versed team. So we began essentially in 2013. So we've been at it for about 12 years. At that time, the market, the demand for soybean in Africa was probably less than 1% of global production. I mean, it's very weak demand. The dominant product was palm oil, and the market was, other than South Africa, was free of genetically modified beans. So there was no GM soybean. Things have advanced in partnership still with lots of U.S. companies and others really developed the market to where it is today, where there's very high growth. And that's what we trace out and wanted to express in the series of articles in Farm Doc was the why the demand for soy is so strong, and then how it plays out, that it is a food import or soy import story. So the why, in brief, is due to the fundamentals, the demographics, where Africa historically was a rural, really dominated, rural population dominated region. It is now fast becoming urban, an urbanized region, meaning that the urban centers are where the growth is, where the economic activity is. And that really bodes well for U.S. exporters, right? Because large urban growth, younger population, it's really a strong demographic. And many of the growers that listen to your program are aware of the demographics that really value soybean and where it moves into the food system and both on food oil and protein for livestock and so forth. So it's really a sweet spot for U.S. exports, this high growth, fast urbanizing market in Africa. Domestic production, and we trace that out in the article, is absolutely not keeping pace with imports or demand. So it's really the gap is being met by foreign imports. So that's the structural demographic reason why this is a great soybean growth story. On the import side, they're looking in the demand, incomes are rising, and they're looking for meal imports, oil imports, and grain imports. Processors are operating at 50% of capacity across the region. We just did a course on training processors in Ibadan, Nigeria, in partnership with USEC, the Soy 360 course, and these processors are trying to find every bean they can find, and that means imports. So the demand is really strong. Now we need to make the markets. So it's an exciting growth story of high-level demand, fastest growing region in the world, young population, and so forth. And Guy did a nice kind of deep dive into demand and the characteristics of countries. Good example, countries like Nigeria and Ghana in West Africa, which the U.S. has a comparative advantage, as well as in Egypt, always a strong market for U.S. And throw it over to Guy to talk about really what's happening on the ground there as examples of the market potential.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, just to take a bit of a deeper look at that, Africa, I think, continues to be a significant growth opportunity with its population growth expected to be the highest in the world moving forward for the next few decades. As Peter said, today, Africa, for the most part, is a very rural population, but the urban population is growing at over twice the rate of what the rural population is. And the interesting thing to note is as populations become urban-based rather than rural-based, their demand changes in a couple of ways. One, generally they get more disposable income. And from that, we see shifts in demand. First thing we see is an increase in vegetable oils. Now, while today palm oil is their biggest consumption, in the urban areas, there's a potential for that to move to soybean oil, particularly as they increase their reliance on imports. The other sector is in the animal protein, particularly in poultry production across Africa. As they increase their protein production, that's both in the form of broilers and egg production, that really drives that demand for soybean meal. And as those populations grow, the demand for both those products, both the oil and the meal, will grow. Now, the urban population is not expected to exceed the rural population until sometime in the 2040s. So it's going to be a bit of an orderly but a fairly rapid growth in there as well. So we're watching that pretty close. Now, when we picked 4 countries to do a bit of a drill down on, we picked 4 very different countries. One, Egypt. Egypt's currently the largest soy product importer in Africa. It's fairly evolved and sophisticated in what I would call as a mature market. We then also took a look at Ghana and Nigeria. They're on West Africa. U.S., as Peter said, has a comparative advantage in exporting to those countries. And then we also looked at Tanzania, which is more tributary to the West Coast, but is probably more typical of the broader underdeveloped areas of Africa there as well, as we look through the challenges and the processes there.
And when you looked at those 4 countries, what information did you gain for what phrase Peter used, making the market for our U.S. growers?
Yeah, well, it's the market access is the first thing. And the key thing for a lot of African countries is do they have a readily available supply of hard currency? A lot of your North Africa countries do have that. Particularly, you look at a country, if they have any sort of exports, generally that's in the form of oil or energy. They tend to have readily available supplies of hard currency. Other countries are a bit more tenuous on that. If they don't have a readily available supply of hard currency, then it can become a bit of an issue. But those, with the exception of Tanzania, Ghana, Nigeria, and Egypt, do have readily available supplies of hard currency, along with a growing demand for food and some basic infrastructure there to get that commodity in with a port situation that can handle bulk goods.
What obstacles do you see for U.S. growers and our U.S. soybeans making it to Africa?
Yeah, happy to talk at a high level. I mean, we have experience in entering new markets, and I guess I'm getting old enough that I have a little bit of that experience of the shift, for example, from Europe over to Asia, because Asia wasn't always our dominant market, and so that was an exciting and challenging shift to move our export focus and our priorities and training and marketing and communication. And now there's a similar challenge for Africa. Africa's unfamiliar, right? We don't tend to travel there. I mean, I have to, for work, have to go there often, but the general public, we don't travel there that often. There isn't a lot of commercial trade. So commercial norms and commercial practices, those are new and different. So that's a hurdle. And this is all not uncommon. It's not unique to Africa. It's just new markets and understanding. Guy talks nicely in the article about port facilities and infrastructure, and he can go into depth on that. So just logistics. And of course, he's already mentioned currency, right? It's going to be in hard currency, so banking and credit instruments and so forth.
That was University of Illinois' Peter Goldsmith, and he was joined by Kansas State University's Guy Allen as they discussed Africa being the next market for U.S. growers. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Peter and Guy as they continue their discussion on this topic. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation about Africa being the next big market for U.S. growers. And continuing to talk about it, we have K-State's Guy Allen and University of Illinois' Peter Goldsmith. Peter, in the last segment, you were discussing some obstacles we see for U.S. growers to be able to get into the market in Africa. And what are some more challenges you see?
Another challenge that we take head on and cover in the third article is about the historical preference for non-GM crops. So policy outside of the country of South Africa generally is not currently open to GM products. Recently, there's been some nice traction in Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, where we work heavily, and we work very closely with a number of companies and policymakers to open the market. This is critical for U.S. growers. The market has to be welcoming to GM corn as well as GM soybean, Roundup Ready, whatever it might be, BT, whatever it might be, so that product can flow. And that's really the hallmark of a commodity market, is that markets are not differentiating and discriminating one product, soy product, from another. If there's an opportunity, we want ships to be able to move directly to Africa, not have to fight GM. So this is what we faced in South America. This was a big issue 25 years ago in the battle of whether South American soy would develop and accept GM products. This is important. So this is also another challenge. And an important opportunity to influence policy and show that agriculture can be much more productive, lower costs, and that GM is really, really favorable to ag market development in Africa. But Guy can talk in more detail about the different policies across, like our 4 example countries, provide a good sample of the challenges that exporters would face.
Yeah, just to expand on that, a couple of different areas I'd sort of like to mention. One is the technical usage of soy and soy products. USEC has really stepped up to that with their Soybean Excellence Centers, training local people in the use, whether it be in the oil situation or probably more deeply in the soybean meal, and how to utilize soy to its highest and best use so that it's competitive, particularly within that protein complex. Then to shift a bit at the institutional structure, one thing we don't think about very often when we're talking about trade is you need some institutional structure in a country to allow that trade to happen. And Egypt is probably the most sophisticated on that, where Tanzania is really, really lacking behind on that, with countries in between at various levels. We mentioned currency and foreign exchange, so you need those financial institutions to facilitate that trade, and then also institutions within the country's government to allow that trade to happen through the different trade issues. Now, on the tariffs and issues, Egypt's pretty open with very, very limited tariffs. Ghana and Nigeria range with heavier tariffs on the products such as oil and meal, not so much tariff on the whole seed. That helps to encourage that domestic processing, where Tanzania is pretty absent of sort of any sort of policy and very protective of their domestic production on that. The other thing that's important is that the trade associations that help facilitate that trade and those various institutional organizations are quite important in both opening those doors and allowing that trade to actually be executed. And it's not something we think about right off the top of our head.
From the perspective of Guy from Kansas State University and Peter from the University of Illinois, what does this mean for our U.S. growers?
I mean, the big issue driving a lot of this is the lack of Chinese demand coming to the U.S., as they've been very selective in buying from South America. So it's quite important. And China's 2/3 of oilseed trade, over 60% goes to China. And if, as we've met these current trade challenges, it's real important that the U.S. diversify its customer base. And Africa is really sitting there with the greatest future potential to diversify our trade, also to a market where we have a notable comparative advantage on transportation and opening up those markets. So I think from a strategic perspective, it's just real important that we're there and have a presence, because Africa has the potential to be larger than the Chinese market in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I'd add on to that guy's spot on in the assessment. One of the things we talk about in the article, and we've been working on this for quite a while, is that growers, that the U.S. industry, just think of what is the strategic plan, what's the strategy to understand, to learn, and differentiate among the countries, because there are lots of 54 countries, lots of different opportunities. They are different, as Guy has said, and that plan and how to learn and understand the market. The challenge is the concept of the industrial standard, and we've talked, both of us, Guy and I, have talked about it in this little brief discussion. Is what is the industrial demand technically for soy? Because right now it's relatively small compared to palm oil, for example. And so that means processors need to switch their equipment, their settings, their norms, their training. And this is what USEC and SIL have been working on to help the industry change, to convert the standard, like it is in whether it be Europe or the US, Asia, or South America, to soybean oil as the base oil and soybean meal as the base protein, so that firms know that they can commit and know that soybeans going to be coming in, they can get access to it. This is the industrial firm. So the industrial standard is really critical to move it away from palm and move it over to soy. And that takes intentional strategy. And with that is GM as part of that industrial standard, because you don't want any barriers to entry, and you want the U.S. product to flow in easily and with as little complication as possible. So that's something we're working on. This is what USEC and SIL through the Soy 360 program are working on, is to try to establish and ease in the conversion to soy as the base industrial protein and oil for the continent.
If things go well, then when do you think U.S. growers will see that Africa is the big market for soybeans?
That's a great question. And I think that's an important one to answer, to do some forecasting and some prediction. We see the growth of imports and we trace it out, the rise of soy oil imports outpacing all other oil imports. We see food imports outpacing domestic production by a third. We see a lot of trends that are quite supportive and supportive of building a proper model to forecast when that might happen. And that would be exciting work. And, part of, as you alluded to earlier, the next steps to figuring out how much to invest, where to invest, when to invest, and you aim before you shoot. And so modeling it out, and that's quite doable. The growers have great resources. They can do that. And that would be the next step.
Look, the opportunity I see for Africa is the fact is that we're not competing over a bigger portion of an existing pie. With the growth that we're expected to see there in Africa, it's growth in demand, it's new demand. So the pie is getting bigger. And from a marketing point of view, when you're in a growth situation like that, that's a lot easier environment to establish a presence and be competitive in there than it is if you're fighting over an existing or a potentially shrinking part of the pie. And with the growth, particularly what underlines that is the growth forecast we see in the population. And that's both in the oil food sector as well as in the animal protein feed sector, particularly on the poultry side of that.
Yeah, Guy's pointing a really exciting time, great potential. The fundamentals are the fundamentals we've seen before, so they're playing out and will play out nicely. And the U.S. growers have comparative advantage in exports. And so a fast-growing new import market is ours for the taking.
Peter, Guy, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was Director and Principal Investigator of the Soybean Innovation Lab at the University of Illinois, Peter Goldsmith, and he was joined by the Senior Economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. If you'd like to read more on these topics, I will link articles that Peter and Guy put out in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Whether it's the potential for an outbreak of bird flu, New World Screwworm, or foot and mouth disease, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that every dairy needs a biosecurity plan.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning biosecurity on their dairy farms. This past week, some of us gathered in Manhattan, Kansas, and went through another animal disease exercise. We do this annually to practice how we might handle an outbreak of something like foot and mouth within our animal industry here in Kansas, but implications of this go across the United States. So as you think about your own dairy farm, you might want to be thinking about biosecurity. And as you move into 2026, if you haven't given this a lot of thought on your dairy, I would encourage you to do so. Our recent experience with bird flu and our continuing threat of bird flu across our herds makes us realize that it is important to be thinking about how we handle biosecurity on our dairy. From the south now, we have New World Screwworm that could be a threat as we move into 2026. And there's always the threat that we might see a foreign animal disease like foot and mouth impact our industry. So as you think about your own dairy, question I might have for you, who has had access to your dairy animals and to your feed in the last week, in the last month, in the last 3 months? Do you actually know who's been on and off your farm? Do you track the animal movements to and from your farm? Many of you probably are moving heifers to a grower or maybe even calves off the farm to other places, and then some point in time those heifers may be coming back to your dairy. Do you track those movements, and how do you manage biosecurity around those animal movements? Many of our dairies here in the state of Kansas do have a secure milk supply plan. That is something that you can obtain through the Department of Agriculture here in Kansas. It really helps set up a biosecurity plan for your dairy. They have many different helps that go along with that and will assist you in doing that. If you've not investigated that, I'd really encourage you to do that. It's really important that you think about how you would handle something like a foot and mouth outbreak that might not be on your farm but be on a neighboring farm or just someplace here in the United States. That secure milk supply plan would help you manage that situation and maybe allow you to sell milk during such an outbreak. So once we have the plan, that's great, but what do you do with that plan? It shouldn't sit on the shelf. It's something that should be reviewed. So if you already have a secure milk supply plan, I would encourage you to take some time to review it. Most importantly, I would take some time to train your employees as to what's exactly in the plan. How do we react on our dairy if we have to stand that plan up, and what will the responsibilities be for individual employees? This is something you have to continually do because most of our dairy employees will change from time to time, so we need to train the group. So looking at it at least once a year or maybe multiple times a year with your employees would be very important. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farms across the state to give some thought to the biosecurity plan on their individual dairy, and if you don't have one, to set one up as soon as possible.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, Gordon Clark has more on the 2026 Kansas Commodity Classic coming up on Friday, January 30th at the Hilton Garden Inn in Salina.
The one-day event is designed to equip Kansas farmers with actionable insights on critical issues impacting their operations, including market trends, long-term weather outlooks, and federal and state legislative actions. The Kansas Commodity Classic is free to attend thanks to the generous support of industry sponsors and includes a complimentary breakfast and lunch for all registered attendees. The 2026 Kansas Commodity Classic will deliver high-level situational awareness and policy briefings directly from the experts, ensuring our state's producers are better prepared to navigate challenges and opportunities in the coming year. Pre-registration for the Kansas Commodity Classic is strongly encouraged and is available at kansascommodityclassic.com. For Kansas Wheat, this is Gordon Clark.
Thanks, Gordon. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.